think I'll speak from up here. First of all, I want to thank Marlene for inviting me back to what's now become an annual event, and a productive one at that, a very good lineup this time around. And I also want to thank all of you for staying this late in the day. Last session, so our job is to make it worthwhile, so you don't go, I should have caught that 3:30 metro. So we will do our level best to make sure that you find that this discussion is worthwhile. Now, my task in this is pretty simple, and I realize we're in a clock-free zone, so I will put my phone there to make sure that I don't go over. Is really to look at a particular chain of events and really decisions made by one outside actor, the United States, but one that has an impact on a number of the regional actors, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, among others, and then draw back and say, well, so what? What does this mean for Central Asia? Throughout the day, we've been looking at different ways in which security is defined, evaluated, viewed in either individual Central Asian countries across the region or by outside actors. And so my attempt here, modest as it is really to look at this particular change or decision that the U.S. has made over the past 6 months with respect to our presence in Afghanistan, and simply ask, what does this mean for our interests in Central Asia, if there are any? Now, quite frankly, I do think that there is a clearer strategy from this administration. I would say there's some continuity from previous administrations because, of course, now with Afghanistan into our 17th year, we can think in terms of multi-administration comparisons. In terms of the challenges this offers, well, quite frankly, there are many. Strategies and ideas are great. Oops. Okay. Are great in terms of political rhetoric, but you eventually have to fill in the details, and here indeed is where the devil lies. And then when it comes to the impact on Central Asia, well, we'll see the so what, so that's the threefold sequence. Now, in terms of the strategy itself, as most of you probably know, on the 21st of August last year, President Trump delivered a speech not too far from here at Joint Base Myers-Henderson Hall, noting that the American people were frustrated with the inactivity and lack of success in Afghanistan and the ongoing expenses and costs in human lives as well that conflict has taken, and we must solve it. So first and foremost, and to quote, he says, our nation must seek an honorable and enduring outcome worthy of the tremendous sacrifices that have been made, especially the sacrifices of lives. So there's a goal of victory. Okay, so number one, we're going to win. Second, this effort is conditions-based, not time-bound. This is critical. And in fact, criticisms, fair enough, can be levied against the Obama administration when in December of 2009, he was quick to note that while Afghanistan is of strategic importance, the withdrawal of U.S. forces will begin in 2011. And in fact, in a good betting pool, you would say by January 2017, that is the last month of his administration, we would have 0 combat troops in Afghanistan. That was the desire in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Iraq, of course, the withdrawal took place earlier, and the goal was to have it in 17 for Afghanistan. Of course, a lot happened in this interim. And we know, of course, the resurgence of the Taliban, the resurgence of opposition force, the rise of the so-called Islamic State of Daesh in Khorasan or in Afghanistan, which caused the U.S. to rethink. However, let's be clear, we went from about 102,000 combat troops, American combat troops, in August of 2011, down to about 8,000 in January of 2017. So a 92% reduction in troops during this time. That's a pretty significant drawdown. So what we're saying now is, forget about timelines, we're there for the long haul or until certain conditions are met. And thirdly, we have to recognize that the threat in the region is really about Islamic terrorist groups. We have to phrase this specifically, Islamic terrorist groups. At my center at National Defense University, we work largely with Muslim participants. And this is a real pickle in terms of having to describe to them that, in fact, no, it is not about Islam, it is about extremism, and yet you also see a pretty heavy rhetoric that says, no, it actually is about Islam. This is a conundrum that within our government we are struggling. And I would say that this sense that the mission for the U.S. is to obliterate, defeat, destroy such groups, is the ultimate goal. Among other things, of course, proliferation of WMD and transregional trafficking, etc. This is important. Now, in terms of actions on the ground, commanders will have a lot more authority to act. They don't have to call back to Washington. If there are civilian casualties, it's unfortunate, but that is the cost of doing business. We will try to minimize those as much as possible, but we're not going to have the same micromanagement we did before. Because ultimately this is about counterterrorism. We have to go out, and it's not, you can cynically say it's whack-a-mole, or you can say we're taking the fight to them. But at the end of the day, that's it. It's not about nation building. It's not about the business of reconstructing a state in the image of the United States. It is not about, propping up a government through all sorts of means. We're going to leave this blank, though, because, of course, what kind of assistance are we looking at? Are we looking at financial assistance? Are we looking at effort? Are we looking at imposing values and transmitting values, Western values, U.S. values, etc.? Now, what's interesting, and just kind of one final comment on this strategy, is outside powers are mentioned. And it's fascinating to see the evolution of how these outside powers are discussed. In the original speech, and then in documents, and then in the national security strategy, which is for South Asia and Central Asia, is this. It's a little less than a page. In this page, the notion of outside powers also comes up, and there are two in particular that are raised. India, which is seen as a regional force for good. It can offer developmental assistance, perhaps security assistance, that's left unclear. And Pakistan, deep sigh, followed by Pakistan has much to gain from partnering with our efforts in Afghanistan. It has much to lose by continuing to harbor criminals and terrorists. When that was presented, we had a group of senior Pakistani officials at our center. Needless to say, these were some fun conversations about having Pakistan as a safe haven, because in fact the narrative in Islamabad is there is a safe haven in the region, and it's all in Afghanistan. Pakistan has no bad guys on its territory. They all keep coming over from the other side. And I think every week there's something in the Post and in sort of the think tank commentary that somehow ferrets out more of this discussion and tension really between the U.S. and Pakistan. And it's no surprise that the media in these countries have picked this up. Now, what are some of the challenges for this strategy? And what does it mean for the U.S. presence in the region? And then by extension, so what about the U.S. and Central Asia? Well, first of all, as I said, despite the flourish of success and victory, specific goals are unclear. There really are no specific goals of what victory looks like. Is it the absence of terrorist groups from the territory of Afghanistan? Is it a government that will be a cooperative partner? Is it regional cooperation? Remember, this has been a goal every once in a while, and I think, as mentioned, Jeff Mankov mentioned it in the first session, the notion of this new Silk Road and the north-south connectivity. Well, a lot of this relied on an Afghanistan that was a strategic hub or partner. Will the Americans want our troops to stay there for another 17 years? Current Pew and Gallup polls suggest otherwise. Anywhere from 55 to 60% say the entire conflict was a mistake. We should have never gone in the first place. You contrast that to the exact same polls that were given in 2002, where 3% said it was a mistake, 95% it was the right thing to do. And so you can see we've had a bit of a shift in our opinions here in the U.S. Secondly, what's the future of our assistance in the region? And again, commentaries on USAID and commentaries on the presence of developmental assistance are important here because this spills over regionally. We're going to spend about $45 billion on Afghanistan. Most of that will be on the military mission. In terms of social assistance, economic assistance. The desire is to quote, it's a program designed to promote American prosperity through investments that expand markets for U.S. exports, help create a level playing field for U.S. businesses. It is not about foreign direct investment. It is not about assistance. It's about creating an environment so businesses can come in and do their thing. We talk about transactional relations. We have to narrow this. It's transactionalism with a business perspective. And I think this is critical when we look at assistance in the region. Finally, to say from a security perspective, I've already noted one of our concerns is, how long will troops stay there? Is it 12,000? Is it going to be 6,000, 8,000? However these conditions are. Ultimately, with this small contingent, what's the mission? The mission, again, is going to be counterterrorism. It's going to be going after specific groups. And interestingly, border protection. Discussions about Tajik-Afghan border security, Afghan-Turkmen border security. For some reason, the Uzbek-Afghan border is deemed wonderfully secure, so we can focus on the others. There's some discussion, but in terms of a northward expression, it's really about managing the border and containing things within. To include, by the way, this rather sticky, unsolved question of reconciliation and extremist groups. And I know Eric's going to be looking at extremism in a bit, or extreme vetting, I should say. And one of the things that comes up, and when we've seen this in action, is people's links with such associations and groups. I would say that this is still the unsolved issue, because on the one hand, we will say that the strategy is all about going after terrorists, yet at the same time, we can say that a political reconciliation is viable. And you have forces on both sides that argue their positions. So what does this mean in the end for Central Asia? First of all, it's been about 8 minutes of Afghanistan, South Asia. What does this mean for Central Asia? Sadly, that Central Asia will remain a region viewed through the lens of Afghanistan and South Asia. Administratively, bureaucratically, this makes sense. In the Defense Department and the State Department, these regions are inextricably linked. They are bureaucratically tied to each other. In a recent Voice of America interview, Alice Wells from the State Department did say that, no, we should not look at it this way, that we need to look at Central Asia and the countries therein, about it. We need to look at their specific challenges and problems. And while I agree, and in fact I support that perspective, all too often when it comes to program execution, when it comes to actually laying out broad policies, we do look at the South Central Asia linkages. Secondly, when it comes to looking at countering Islamic extremism, again, that phrase, it's interesting that the reach of such groups are seen as problematic for the Central Asian states when security discussions with Central Asian partners comes up. And I'm thinking more specifically within the Defense Department. This connection, this concern is raised increasingly. It's not about internal security. It's not about great powers coming in. It really is focusing on extremist groups. And even this, the threat of the so-called returning foreign fighters, which is now the buzz phrase throughout the region, not just Central Asia, by the way. We see this in Southeast Asia, South Asia, in Central Africa, in Europe, and yes, even the United States. The notion that somehow the thousands of foreign fighters who somehow got out of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq will have some place to go does keep a few people up at night, and it is a concern. Now, my concern is that if this becomes our focus, and if this is the way we evaluate foreign and security policy in the region, we limit other ways to engage these states. We really just look at this counterterrorism. It's not just, oh, our toolkit is getting smaller. It's we just simply have a hammer in our toolkit, and that's it. And we're just going to keep using this for any effort. Now, what I would say finally on this is, this lack of interest in nation building is parallel, and a few comments were made earlier today, and happy to continue this discussion in the Q&A, of a lessening of interest, or at least commentary on human rights, democratization, other efforts, political party development, NGO development. And there's clearly a debate on this. There are some who say it's not our business to impose Western values, and in fact you see this in a number of official documents, that we are not going to tell other people how to live. You know, what happens in their borders, it's almost a non-interference in the internal affairs of other states, all at Beijing, that seems to resonate. You see this in broader security documents from top officials, including National Security Advisor McMaster last year in the Wall Street Journal, who presented what I see as not just a realist approach, but it's a neo-Hobbesian approach of foreign affairs, where we really just look out for ourselves, where American interests, American markets are deemed primus inter pares, and it's not just an American first mantra, it is a way to do business. In fact, interestingly, the threats of tariffs this weekend actually fall quite well into that, so something to think about. So in the end, what can we say in terms of our engagement and the so what? And whether we look at the next 3 years or 7 years of this administration or its successors, are we thinking in terms of a continued or a furthering of U.S. engagement in Central Asia, or a lessening or even a disappearance? And I would say it's interesting, on a bilateral basis, we've seen a lot of positive rhetoric. It's fascinating to see that, you know, discussions earlier about, you know, Uzbekistan, the United States, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. The language is going in the right way. Unfortunately, from the U.S. perspective, this business transactional approach requires that companies and other forces invest in. It's going to be less of a government-led engagement. A lot can be said about that. What I'd like to just have to end, though, is a quick question that you would say from the other side, because transactions go both ways. You know, we tend to think of it, and I should say as an American, I would tend to look at it more from the American perspective. What is the value of the U.S. engaging with Central Asia? From the Central Asian perspective, what's the value in engaging with us? If we're not bringing a lot of cash, if we're not bringing a lot of support, if perhaps we're not even bringing a way to balance other powers, is it worth working with us? And particularly if the Afghanistan situation is one that's going to remain really a limited counterterrorism engagement, does that feed that narrative, that engagement focus? But these 100+ reforms of President Mirziyoyev, well, that's not going to tap into most of those, so he's going to have to look in other directions. And what I would say is, could we be an actor in the region? Well, we could be a unique player, but at the end of the day, we're going to see the U.S. most likely limit itself to these areas I've noted, and unless there's a radical policy shift, expect more of the same on that. But again, happy to dwell on more of this in the Q&A, but I'm going to stop for here and turn it over to my panelists. So thank you very much.